Hey, what's up? In this episode, we're going to talk about Stripe Connect onboarding for custom accounts with Ruby on Rails. And we've already got a dashboard set up. We have this accounts page. What we're going to do now is add a button to the accounts page that when clicked will create a Stripe account using the API, and then will redirect us through the custom Connect hosted onboarding flow. So the first thing I wanted to do was take a look at our accounts controller, and you'll notice that it's very bare bones right now. We do want to have a before action that will make sure that the user is logged in before they get to this page. In fact, I think we also need this in our dashboards controller, so we'll drop that in there. On our accounts controller, we're gonna have some create action that when it's fired, it will create an account in the database, and then it's gonna use some helper to make an API call. So the first thing we need to do is have somewhere in the database to store these accounts. So let's say Rails G model account, and it's going to have the Stripe ID. That's going to be the Stripe account ID. We're also going to want to know if it has the payouts enabled, and that's a Boolean. We're going to have charges enabled. That's also a Boolean. And we might also collect a bunch of other stuff, but for now, I think this is probably a good start. Oh, also accounts are going to have a foreign key relationship back to a user. Now, technically, we could have stored these three columns on the user model, but one thing we want to avoid is adding too many things on top of our user object. And so what we're going to do is have a one-to-one relationship between a user and account. If in the future we need to support multiple Stripe accounts, that'll make it really easy because we can switch our has one to has many, do some refactoring, and we've got all the tables and the data where we need it to be. All right, so let's say this is also going to have user references, and that should set up a foreign key relationship for us. Let's take a look at the migration here, and we see that we have a Stripe account ID, we've got payouts enabled, charges enabled, and we are good to go. All right, so let's also create some class that is going to be used for working with Stripe account objects. So we're going to need to do things like create the account or link to the account, or we might have to like sync the account later. So I'm going to create a new directory inside of app called Stripe, and this is going to be where all of my helpers live. So I'm going to say, I'm going to create another thing in here called a Stripe account.rb, and that's going to be the class that helps me interact with Stripe accounts through the API. So we'll come back and implement our Stripe account later, but for now, what we want to do is start creating these accounts in the database. So let's take a look at our accounts controller, and we're going to add our create method here. The create method is what handles post requests that are coming from the front end. So we're going to say at account is account.find or create by user, and the user is going to be the current user. Now what we want to do is say like service is Stripe account.new, and we're going to pass in at account. Now we want to say like service.create account, and then we're going to redirect to service dot onboarding URL. So this create account method doesn't work or doesn't exist yet. So if we go to this Stripe account, the Stripe account object here, none of these methods exist yet. So we need to implement an initialize that's going to take in the account. We also need to implement a create account method that's going to make a call to the Stripe API. We also need to implement some onboarding URL. So we're going to implement all of those now. So this create account method is going to be where a lot of the API call magic happens. This onboarding URL is going to be an account link. So I think at this point we should be good to go. So if we try to call create account, we should return early if we already have an account ID. So if the account has a Stripe ID present, then we want to return early. And I'm going to actually use an adder reader for account so that I'm using bare words everywhere. Now, otherwise, if we don't already have an account, then we're going to create a brand new one by saying Stripe account.create, and we're going to pass in a bunch of different stuff. So the first thing is that we need to specify a type. And this will give us back I guess this is going to be a Stripe account. And what we want to do is ultimately update the underlying account and set its Stripe ID to the ID that comes back from the Stripe API. Now, this API call accepts tons of arguments. So if we go to stripe.com/docs/api/accounts/create, then we should be able to see all of the arguments that we can pass when creating a new Stripe account. So we specified the type already. We can also specify the country. I'm going to do that now. For now, we'll just allow creators to be in the US. The email, that can be the user's email address. Capabilities. So we need to pass in a set of capabilities that are enabled on the Stripe account. This is how we unlock different features of the Stripe account. So whether or not we want to accept ACSS or different kinds of payments. We're also going to want to enable card payments generally. So here we're going to say capabilities, and we need to pass in a bunch of things that we're going to request. So in card payments is going to be one. So we're going to say requested true. We are also going to want payouts, or it's called transfers now. So we're going to say transfers requested true. And so in addition to those two, we're also going to enable treasury. And we are also going to enable card issuing. So card issuing and treasury. So treasury and card issuing are going to be what allow us to add embedded finance to our application later to unlock a lot of these really cool features around storing and sending money, or issuing virtual credit cards that our creators can then go and use to spend immediately. So this is, so we've got our capabilities. Now, it's worth noting that we don't have to pass anything other than the type, and the rest of this information can be collected inside of the hosted checkout, but we could potentially pass in addresses, phone numbers, any of the details that we have about this account. But for now, we're gonna just leave it at this and see how much we have to fill in during onboarding. But this should get us started at least. Yeah, so in order to play around with this, the last thing we need is the onboarding URL. And the onboarding URL, we're gonna use another API that's of Stripe's called the AccountLinks. So we're gonna use this Ruby method here to create a brand new account link. So I'm actually just gonna copy that, drop it in here. In this case, the account ID is gonna be the account.stripe ID. The refresh URL and return URL are going to be two URLs that we want the user to go to. In this case, they're both going to be the accounts URL, and the type is going to be account onboarding. Okay. So there's one other argument that we can pass here, and that is what we want to collect. So if we're creating custom Stripe accounts or express Stripe accounts, we can say that we want only the requirements that are currently due, or we can say collect everything that may eventually be due. So what I want to do is say collect and pass in eventually due. That way users, when they go through the onboarding flow, they collect everything that they might need, and then they should be off to the races. All right. At this point, we should be able to hit our accounts create action, passing in nothing as a logged in user, and we should be redirected to this onboarding URL. This is going to be a URL that is hosted by Stripe. So we have to say allow other host true, and then we're going to set the status to see other so that it redirects. All right. So from our accounts index, let's create a new form where the action is /accounts. The method is post. We're going to have a hidden input that is going to have the name is going to be authenticity token, and that's going to have our form authenticity token to prevent CSRF. And now we just need a button. So I'm going to go over to Tailwind UI, grab a button that looks nice. All right, the type here is going to be submit, and the button, we want the button to say something like create a Stripe account. It looks like we have some migrations that need to run. So we'll say Rails DB migrate. Refresh the page. Now we have a button here that says create a Stripe account. So we click on this account. When we click on the button, we see this error, uninitialized constant accounts controller Stripe account. That's because we created a brand new directory called Stripe, but we didn't restart the server, and so the server didn't know how to auto load that yet. So let's try this again. We'll go to the accounts page, click on create a Stripe account, and we are missing a comma or something. So let's go back to our Stripe account thing and add a comma there, refresh the page, and let's see, create Stripe account, unknown capability Treasury. Okay, so in order to use Treasury, we have to go through Treasury onboarding. I have an account that is already onboarded to Treasury, so I'm gonna update my credentials and change my secret key to one of my accounts that already has onboarded to Stripe Treasury. So I'm gonna go to the dashboard, get my API keys, and I'm gonna copy this API key. While I'm here, I might as well grab my publishable, my publishable key, and I'll drop that there. And we're good to go. Okay, one last time for all the marbles. Okay, undefined local variable or method accounts URL, but we should have account.stripe ID, and we do. Okay, so that's great. We have created a Stripe account, so that's fantastic. If we look back at the server log, we should have received some notifications. Oh, right. Okay, the other thing we want to do now that we're using this different Stripe account, is we want to say Stripe login and make sure that we are authenticated with the same Stripe account so that our webhooks that are being forwarded are for the same account. Okay, so now we should be good to go to say bin dev and refresh this page. Okay, so the reason that the accounts URL isn't available inside of Stripe account is because it does not have the URL helpers. So we need to include rails.application.routes.url helpers. That way we can have access to these helper methods for the accounts URL method. All right, so if we refresh and click on create a Stripe account now, missing host to link to, please provide this in the default URL options. I thought this was set up in our development RB mailer default URL options, right? So if we look at rails.application.config.actionMailer, then we are seeing a bunch of stuff. So default URL options. Yeah, so we see the host is localhost and the port is 3000. So I fully expected that rails.application.url helpers.accounts URL. I thought it was going to use that. Does it not use that? All right, so we're missing the host to link to. This is again because we are inside of a class. So we included this URL helpers, but it does not know, or it doesn't have any context about the default URL options. So what we're going to do is just make a method here called default URL options, and we're going to return rails.application.config.actionMailer.default URL options. That will make it so that it should use the default mailers options under the hood. So let's try this again. Undefined method to model for Stripe account link. Okay, cool. So we're creating the account link, but then we just returned the entire thing. So we're going to say this is the link, and we want to return link.url. That's right. So actually we can just say return this thing.url. That should work just fine. Create a Stripe account. Okay, so now what we want to do, or now what's happening is it looks like a no-op, but if we open up the network tab, what we'll see is that we are actually being redirected, but we're getting a CORS error, and that's because we're being redirected client-side by Turbo. So let's go back to our accounts index, make this form. We'll disable Turbo by saying data Turbo is false, because this is ultimately redirecting out. All right, now we are on the Connect onboarding flow. So we're going to enter a test account number, test@example.com. I'm going to say continue. Use the test code. Now we need to start setting up the type of business. when we're talking about creators, the type of business is almost always going to be individual. And as we're going through this onboarding flow, we want to think about the things that we can remove from the onboarding flow because we just know them about our users. So when we're looking at the API reference for creating an account, we can kind of think carefully about what arguments we want to pass when we're creating the account originally. So in this case, we can go back to our Stripe account thing, and when we're creating the account, we can set the business type to individual. That will make it so that users don't actually have to select this as they go through. All right, let's see what's on the next page. Right now, we don't have any of the information about the user filled in. So this is going to be something like test at example.com, and then 0101 1901. There's a bunch of test strings, like magic strings, that will allow you to go through this onboarding flow automatically. But for now, one other thing that we know that we can enter is the email address. So when we are creating a new Stripe account for a business type of individual, one thing that we can fill in is the individual's email address. So we can also pass that. So here we can say individual, and we can say email is account.user.email. So we know that that is part of their onboarding flow. Address, full match, and then we might say, I don't know, San Francisco, California, 94111. And then in terms of phone number, we want to probably enter a real phone number, 8675309. And then for social security number, we can enter all zeros in test mode, and that should create our personal, or verify our personal details. So in practice, what I generally like to do is set up that Connect onboarding with as much detail as possible so that users don't have to go through the same flow every single time. So most of our users are going to be selling digital products. In fact, they're going to be selling sort of blogs or written content. So one thing we can do is we can figure out what the industry is for this, and we can pre-populate it on the professional details. Now their website is going to be, for now, we'll just say https cjav.dev test. And we can come back and fill in what this industry is when we see the MCC code, or the merchant category code, for blogs and written content that's going to be set up for this account. Okay, now we can click accept. This is going to agree to the terms of service for card issuing and also terminal and some other things. So we're going to say accept there. And finally, this is where we're going to just submit and be done with the onboarding flow. And we should be redirected back to our accounts page. Okay, so now at this point, we've had a bunch of different events fire on our account. So if we were to look at the logs here and look at all of the events that came in under Stripe, we have tons and tons of different objects that flowed in for our onboarding events. So we're going to go over to our dashboard here, and we're going to go to Connect, and we need to look at test mode, and we're going to look at our most recently created test account. And in here, we should see some logs. Okay, here are the logs for this account. And this is going to be the most recently updated version of the account. So the MCC for the business profile here is going to be 5818, and the industry is digital products, content, blogs, articles. And what's nice about that is we should be able to pre-populate that information on our business profile. So when we're creating this account under the business profile argument, we can pass in the MCC code. So the MCC for business profile is going to be that code. Because we're creating this platform, we know exactly what each of the creators is selling. This is another thing that users don't have to pick. It also kind of removes any of the fear about getting that answer wrong, or it also removes the ability for users to successfully use this platform for anything different. Let's take a look at what else is available inside of that business profile. We've got the product description and support email. So we can add the support email here as the account.user.email. We might also add support phone or support URL. The business profile URL, for now, we're going to just set it to this, hard-coded. But in practice, because this platform is going to enable creators to sell stuff, we will know the URL, their public-facing URL and custom domain that we want users to be redirected to as part of their business profile, but we don't know it exactly yet. The product description is going to be digital creations and content. Okay. So we want to just go through, pre-populate as much as we can. And at this point we have a brand new account. So on our accounts index, we should iterate over those accounts and list them out. So current user.account.stripe ID, just print it out for now. User has no method account. So we'll go to the user model and say a user has one account. All right, so now we see the account ID. We also want to know, like, are the charges enabled, or what are the other details about that Stripe account that matter? So we can go to Tailwind UI, go to our components here, and we want some sort of data display. I think a description list probably makes sense. Maybe it's overkill, but for now this is going to be fine. So we're just going to say, like, this is your, like, payment account information, Stripe account. I don't know. Then we'll just say Stripe ID. Current user.account.stripe ID. And then we're going to say charges enabled. Current user.account.charges enabled. So as the account goes through this updating flow, it will transition from not having any charges enabled or payouts enabled to having those enabled. So initially, an account, you can't actually collect money with it, and you can't actually send money from it or like pay money out of the account. And so as those details are collected through onboarding, charges become enabled. And then once we have an external account that we can pay money to, it will allow us to send money out of this account. So we're also going to say payouts enabled. So we can say current user.account.payouts enabled. And let's just look and see what this looks like. Okay, so we have our account ID. We have charges and payouts enabled. Doesn't show anything. And then we can just remove the rest of these lines now. Okay. All right, and then we can remove this one. And then this form is too close to the header, so I'm going to add a class of margin top 4. And okay, so now that's too close to this thing, so we'll add a margin top of 4. And things are looking pretty good. Okay, so charges enabled. I don't know why nothing is printing out there. It might be that it's nil. Okay, so that's fine. So what we want to do then is go to, actually, I wonder, since these are Boolean fields, yeah, we should be able to say charges enabled and payouts enabled, and that'll give us, okay, so that gives us a little breakdown. All right, so at this point, we are going through the Connect onboarding flow. We have a new account created, and we have collected some information. Now what we want to do is start listening for account-related webhooks so that we can start transitioning some of these statuses. So we already have webhooks set up, or we have a system for handling webhooks set up. So what we want to do is look at event.last. So we want to find the events where the type is account.updated. We can say event.where, and then data, because we're using a JSON column, we can say account.updated. I think we might need to use double quotes around the outside here. And let's see, count, and then this might also need single quotes. Where, event.where, data type. Okay, so event.last. So this is the type right here. So that should be in the JSON data, right? Yeah, event.where, data for the type is, I don't know, question mark, and then put this, let's see. Oh, updated. Okay, I just didn't have a D. So then this one should have worked with a D. Okay, great. So we've got, how many do we have? .count. Okay, so we have 8 account updated webhook events that have not been processed. So inside of those webhook event updates, there's going to be a bunch of different statuses and context. But the one that's the most important is going to be sort of these capabilities and or the ones that are the most important is charges enabled and payouts enabled for now. And then we're going to use some other signals to tell us what other statuses we should transition. So what we're going to do is inside of our webhook handler, our handle event job, we're going to have another event type that we're handling here called account.updated. Handle account updated with the Stripe event. So we're going to say handle account updated. And for this event, what we want to do is we want to update the local event. So we're going to say account is account.find by Stripe ID. And that's going to be Stripe account is going to be Stripe event.data.object. So the Stripe account .id. And now we want to say account.update charges enabled and payouts enabled. So we're just going to pull the charges enabled and payouts enabled data directly off of these event objects. So if we look carefully and we dig through all of this data, event.data.object is going to be an instance of a Stripe account. And that has charges enabled, and that notice that on this event that's true, so that's good. And it also has payouts enabled, and that's still false. So we're going to leave that as false. But what we can do now is we should be able to reload and say, what is the ID of this last event? Event 55. So E is event.find 55. And now we can say handle event job.perform now for that event. Now if we say account.last, now we see that charges are enabled, and that's true. So if we come back over here and refresh the page, now we see that charges are enabled. So that's great. So payouts are not going to be enabled until we have a valid external account. So we've created the Stripe account, and now that Stripe account needs somewhere to send the money that has been received through payments. And that is going to be called an external account with relation to the Stripe account. In order to create an external account, we can either connect to one of our actual bank accounts that lives outside, maybe at Wells Fargo or Bank of America, Chase, whatever. Or what we can do now is we could create a new kind of internal account called a financial account. This is another bucket of money that would live right inside of Stripe. It gives you faster payouts, faster money movement, a whole bunch of benefits. It's similar to a bank account, but it's not a bank account. And we can use that financial account as our external account. So we're going to pause here. We're going to call this good and say that we've kind of like made it to the step where we now need to connect some external bank account for payouts. But at this point, we are actually sitting really good. And in the next episode, we'll talk about how we're going to set up that financial account and actually start using that as our external account. So we kind of keep everything inside of Stripe. So stick around for that. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.